All right, teachers are back for one last live session with the summit. So if you can hear us and you can see us, let's put a number in the chat, 1 through 5, how excited you are for this upcoming school year. Now that you have all these ideas of what to do and how to teach things. All right, that's pretty good.
There's some good numbers there.
Yeah, 4s and 5s are pretty good. I was thinking we're gonna get some lower numbers. -11. All right, so for this last session, it's a little bit different than the ones before. Before we were talking about specific essays. And today in this session, we're gonna focus a little bit more on the content and how to really manage teaching all the content in these history courses. So I've got Laura Mitchell and Ross Dunn here, and I'm gonna let them take it away, and I'll be here to answer questions and just drive conversation. Hey guys.
Hi, who's running the slides? Who's controlling the slide movement?
I am.
Laura. Okay, go ahead.
All right, Ross, are you ready? There you are.
Yeah.
So Ross, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Well, if you all read the bullets below, you can get a quick idea. I've been thinking about this question of questions in the history classroom for a long time. So I'm very happy to be here today and to talk about this subject. Laura?
Thanks, and hello everyone. I teach African history and world history at the University of California in Irvine, and I teach world history with great enthusiasm, but as the result of one of the biggest lies I've ever told in my life, which was my first assistant professor job interview. I said, of course I could teach world history. And I figured out pretty quickly that initially I couldn't, that it was a much bigger thing than I had taken on, and trying to figure out what that is and how to present it to future teachers, which was my first job to prep. So that's the journey that has taken me being really excited and invested in thinking about what world means, not only as an intellectual field and the kinds of questions we can grapple with, but also what it means for teaching and thinking about making this a manageable, teachable field. And one of the greatest highlights of my professional life was working with Ross to put together a world history textbook, Panorama, a World History. So we're going to start by thinking about how we began to make sense of world history, right? And there's multiple ways of telling world history stories and of telling historical stories. So Amanda, if you're ready, I want to play just some short clips from a couple of videos easily available online about world history. So we'll start with the Bill Wirtz.
I'm like super zoomed in.
I don't have audio.
Yeah, Amanda, there's no audio coming through.
Oh man, I'm like enjoying it out here. All right, I'm not sure how to share audio on my screen with this. I'm sorry. All right, well, basically he makes a lot of jokes about how he's in the Big Bang at this point.
Yeah.
All right.
No, I'm seeing from the
you can see the video, you just can't hear it.
Yeah, some people know the video.
Awesome. Well, I'll drop both of the links in the comments.
Okay.
And then the second video that you guys had was David Christian, who also has a recorded session on the site. And this is his TED Talk of Big History that pretty much launched the entire Big History project. And so in 18 minutes, he does the entire history of the world. So I'll drop both of these links in here so you can watch all of them later.
Well, we can go ahead. If there's no audio, then
apologies.
Part of what I was hoping the participants would be able to begin to think about, right, are different styles of storytelling. And in the Bill Wirtz video, right? It's all animation. It's very quirky. He is a sound and video artist. And so he's using a lot of sound effects. It's very short and punchy. You get a sense of like what this is, right? The history of the entire world, I guess. And Wirtz is doing a pretty decent job at a canned overview of what a lot of state syllabi look like for on grade level teaching of world history, somewhere in the grades 6 through 12, depending on where that falls in your state. Right? And his story is one that is very events based. This happened, this happened, this happened, this happened. He's narrating that in, as I said, this kind of punchy, quirky style. And then you get to David Christian's TED Talk, right? And David Christian is a university-based academic. He's been thinking about what not only world history is, but big history. Where is the place for humans, not just on the planet, but in our cosmos? And how do we understand that? Right? David's newest book is called Origin Story, where he is thinking about the scientific understanding of Big Bang and the chemical and physical processes that led to the creation of the Earth as we know it, as an origin story on par with the origin stories that come in the Bible or the Quran or any other kind of mythological foundation stories that you will have talked about with your students in period 1. So these are two really different approaches to thinking about how to tell a story, right? One is events-based, and for Christian, the way he poses this story is much less events-based than theoretical. And then it's not that nothing specific happens in his theoretical telling, but what I mean by theoretical is that he has a conceptual understanding of the work history is doing and the way he wants to tell a story for a particular end, right? But whether you're Wirtz and the event story or Christian and this theoretical, here's a meaning of the past and a way in which humans are actively making meaning, the only way that they're getting their stories told in a reasonable amount of time is because they are picking and choosing. They are making intentional, specific choices about what they want you to see in this video, what they want to include in their story, and what they are comfortable leaving out. And so,
Can I interject something there, Laura? I just wanted to mention, some of you are familiar with the World History for Us All website, the model curriculum. And so therefore, you probably are familiar with the 7-minute history of the world that appears on the first page, on the home page of the site. I'd have to say that that one is also events-based, but the events go by very fast, and they go faster and faster as we come closer to the present. So if you haven't seen it in World History for Us All, take a look at it. It was written by 2 middle school teachers.
Nice.
all right, so that last slide, right, asks, well, if Wirtz and Christian can tell these stories in 17 and 18 minutes respectively, why in the AP world are we having, these large scale national conversations that are really convulsions about trying to do it in a school year? And so last slide, snippily asks, if they can do it in such a short amount of time, what's so hard about doing it in a school year? And my answer to that question is everything. Everything is hard about trying to create a functional historical narrative that makes sense for your students, that works on that, with their skills and ability, right? It's one thing to hand them a thick, giant book and saying, okay, if you want to understand world history, read this. But if they don't have the reading skills, then you haven't done a very good job of being able to explain world history to them. So getting it condensed into the time available in your classroom and being targeted for your students is incredibly difficult. And one of the things that Ross and I want to get out of the hour that we're going to spend together is giving you strategies for making that an approachable project for you and for your students.
And by the way, this is through a world history context, but everything that we're going to talk about in this session is totally applicable to US and Euro.
So Ross, you want to take over?
Right. I think very closely related to the question we're talking about today is the much broader issue of what teachers think they're doing when they're teaching world history. And I know that the answers to that question are not going to be all the same. But in fact, many world historians are thinking about world history in terms of its innovations over the past 2, 3, 4 decades from what it was before. And we've begun to use the term the new world history. It's not quite as new as it was several years ago, but I would still call it new in many respects because it hasn't penetrated into the wider profession as much as I would like, certainly not into high schools and middle schools as much as I would like. I like to take credit, in fact, for inventing the term, the New World History. I edited a book. Now there's a new version, co-edited with Laura and Carrie Ward, but the first version came out in 2000, and that edited volume of essays was called The New World History. And after that, I kept hearing the term. So I may be wrong, but I'd like to take credit for inventing the term. So what do we mean by the New World History? It has a number of elements. Let me just go through those quickly. First one is that we continue, as we've done conventionally, to investigate nations, civilizations, regions, even hemispheres. But we tried to do it with an eye to the larger context, to put civilizations and other units that we study into a bigger frame, to situate it in relation to what is happening in the world around it. Just take a conventional subject like the French Revolution. We're never going to really understand the French Revolution very well if we pay attention only to what was going on in France during the period 1789 to 1799. And I think we all can understand that. The second feature is really what we're talking about today, and that's asking good questions, including big questions about the human past. And I would prefer if we all stop talking about how much we have to cover, because let's problematize that word, cover. What does that really mean? Covering facts, covering ideas? I'm not quite sure I know. But asking big questions is important. Now, history teachers and certainly college professors don't do that as much as you might think. None of us do. It's important because historians, whenever they're working, they're doing that all the time. The purpose of historical research is to address and even possibly answer questions, big and small. But we have to think about the big questions, the ones that extend beyond the scope of the state or nation or civilization. A third issue is investigating developments that cross the borders of regions, nations, and civilizations. Something we didn't used to do very much, but we're doing it more and more. Just take a simple example would be study of the Black Death, which most of you teach in world history. So you can't study the Black Death just by looking at southern England. You need a hemispheric projection. Then there's investigating the interactions among peoples and societies. Now that one we know well because AP really stresses that. Interconnections, interactions, interrelations. And that's vital to this approach. Comparing and contrasting is as well. And especially if you're studying the world or the hemisphere, you can look around during a given period at developments in several different places, and that sets you up to make comparisons and contrasts. If you're studying Mesopotamia buried in a dig somewhere on the banks of the Tigris, and not yet thinking at all about Egypt or the Indus Valley, then you're not going to think about comparisons. But if you're conceptualizing your topic as all three of those civilizations, it's different. And then finally, investigating the past on various scales of time, space, and subject matter. And we're going to come to that right away.
So if we're thinking with scale, right, that, as I'm sure you're all familiar, helps us move from looking in at a microscopic level, at a close-up level, zooming back to get kind of a landscape picture, or zooming all the way back to see a panorama of events, a panorama of level of processes. And world historians methodologically bang on about this a lot, but teachers should be really interested in this because of what education research, particularly that done by Peter Lee coming out of the UK, shows us is that students get deeper retention and better understanding if they're learning how to think with scales and how to anchor what they're learning into a larger context. Right?
If you're studying nothing but one detail after another, then you learn the details, which you're likely soon to forget. So it's all about relating details to the larger scope. And there's not just Peter Lee, but there's a lot of research that backs that up, especially from England, but also from this country.
And so I want to provoke you. We're going to take a little bit of time and ask you to sit and think and write something on your own. You're welcome to share it in the comments box if you want, or if you just want to write for yourself. I want to ask you to think about big picture questions, right? And how those relate to your students and what you're going to do with students in your class. What kinds of questions would you ask your students to prompt them to think about their relationship, right, to their locality, right, as we move through scale, their community, their city, even their school, depends on how micro you want to get. A question to get students to interrogate their relationship to the planet, right? Why are they taking a world history course? Why aren't we just focused on a local history of the school or the community or the city? Why bother to try and ask a question about the planet? And finally, do your students have a sense of themselves in the universe on a cosmic scale? Students who are particularly religious might gravitate towards that more easily. Those who aren't will need a little bit of prompting. So what kinds of questions would you ask? I'm going to give you a couple of quiet minutes to start crafting those questions. And answer Norma. Hello, Norma. How are you?
That's awesome. So I'm just going to kind of like think out loud to help to try to like answer the question that you just said. Is it like where about where you live and also like how you are connected to your surroundings, whether based on the scale?
How you connect and what are the questions that you want to ask to understand your position there?
Okay, so like what kinds of questions could you ask kids to help them understand where they live on different scales and how they connect to those different things?
Yeah.
Love it. All right,
well,
attendees, you're on the spot.
Yeah, a comment from Barbara that her students would answer that this is a graduation requirement, right? And so what I'm trying to provoke you to do is not ask your students, why are they taking this class, right? But how are they understanding their place in the world? And can this class be something that helps them do that rather than just a graduation requirement?
We have a comment down here from Michael. Are they targeting a philosophical response? I don't think so.
Yeah, no, if your students would go there, I think that's great. The students that I have, most of them would gravitate towards much more, as college freshmen, much more material, practical responses, that their relationship to their community is through family, their relationship to the larger world is maybe the circulation of goods. Where's their latest iPhone being made and how is that being shipped around the world, or relationships to global politics.
Comments are flooding in here.
Yes.
So this last one says, like you could ask kids about how old they are. How do you think of your daily life compares to that of other people your age?
Yeah, those are great
That's
questions.
cool. Yeah. So like, what are other 15-year-olds in the world doing, or how might your life compare to someone else's? Yeah, even just asking them like, where do
Yeah.
you live is kind of a cool question because there's so many different ways to answer that.
So,
What is home? That's a good one. That's very good.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm going to move on to the next slide. I think Ross is going to talk through this to talk about some more concrete historical examples about moving through scale.
Right. I was just coming back and thinking about that question I just mentioned, and one way of thinking about it would be when a student looks around his or her state, what questions might be asked about scale. Now, I teach in Southern California, and it's pretty hard not to think about living in California without setting it in the context of the whole Pacific Basin, because of so many products that are coming from Asia, going back to Asia, the immigration from Asia into California, that impact and affect the daily lives of the students themselves. Now, there are going to be different answers to that question if you live in Iowa. I don't know quite how they would be different, but they would be different. Looking down at these three boxes here, and start with the one down at the lower right-hand corner. Bob Bain, whose name I'm sure some of you know, has been using this term called nesting historical study. And that is to put smaller scales of inquiry into larger boxes, if you will, to bigger questions, and then put those bigger questions possibly into even larger questions. So, for example, here, a smallest picture, and we can call them pictures, big pictures, small pictures. Why was coal so important to industrialization in England? Well, that's a pretty conventional question for anyone teaching a world history course, and you probably ask it. But that leaves some other things open. If you said, why did the Industrial Revolution occur in England? You know, that might be part of the main answer. Oh, because they have coal, or because they have a lot of fast-moving streams, or one or another thing. But let's go to a bigger picture. How could England have industrialized if it had not been involved in world trade? Would it even have been possible? So we have to look at the scale of the world there right away. Maybe only the Atlantic world, but I would think the whole world. So one example very simply would be England cannot produce a single field of cotton. All the cotton that drove the early Industrial Revolution had to be imported from somewhere else. That would be one thing to talk about. Then a really, really big picture. Why did human ability to produce goods start to soar upward in the 18th century? And you have to ask questions like this because nothing like this had ever happened before in the previous 300,000 years of human history. So this was a big deal. And it requires a clear explanation, even though there's a lot of debate among historians as to how and why this happened. So, you know, we have to look at all of these different scales, or at least three of them, and we teach world history courses.
One interesting question here is about whether it's better to go from small to big or big to small when sort of unpacking this with students.
Well, I like the idea of starting big. And as far as AP goes, I think that could be really, really helpful. Unfortunately, the AP course description, the guidelines, are not formulated in terms of questions at all. They're formulated in terms of statements, as if the AP description is giving you answers without asking any questions.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that if you have a big topic in AP like the Industrial Revolution, let's start with the biggest picture to set the global scene. A picture about humankind and not just about English merchants who live in Manchester, right? And then go from there down into smaller pictures and down into detail. If you stick with just detail, you're going from one detail to another and never asking, why the heck did this happen? It's so strange to have had the Industrial Revolution given the past human history. So I like to start with the big question, at least get them framed, and then come back to them as you're studying more detailed subjects.
Yeah, and I like to mix it up over the course of what for me is an academic quarter, so the 10 weeks that I have students. I certainly start the class with big picture questions, and the first couple of units start on the biggest picture, but then I intentionally mix things up as students are starting to develop skills. And we'll start the next unit maybe in a middle context and ask them to work through the textbook and find the details or the small picture that support the middle, and then to do the work of bridging up to the context. And sometimes we'll start a lesson, and again, definitely, in a 10-week term, I wouldn't do this until at least week 4, starting with a really tight case study and having them do the work to build it out. But it depends on what your student population is. My students are successful at that, but I've got pretty high performing students at the college level to start with.
Barbara makes a really good point down at the bottom with that process going big to small. You will lead to comparison, because once you have big questions framed, then you're going to want to find answers in different contexts. The context of England, the context of France, the context of Egypt at the same time, perhaps, and compare what's happening in those different places. That's very good, very important to it.
Yeah, no, and there's good comments following up on that from Elizabeth too. So
right,
and
I see.
Amanda, I just want to double check. The participants can all see each other's comments, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Who's laughing?
Someone in the background. Sorry.
Here are some examples of really big questions that come out of the AP course and design framework, course and exam framework. Sorry, I've lost the AP terminology.
It's under reasoning skills.
Yeah.
These questions, yeah.
And Ross had already pointed out that a lot of the way in which the College Board course is framed, because of the requirements of the College Board, right, are in positive statements, or, as you know from working with your students on the sample exam questions, most of the exam questions aren't questions, they're prompts. Right? So they say something like this: explain the relative historical significance of specific historical developments in relation to larger patterns of continuity and or change. Right? This is the basic change in continuity skill that the course emphasizes. And then below, right, so those are the AP concepts in blue here, and below that are questions that Ross and I developed to think about how to make these kinds of big scale concepts more concrete. So a continuity and change question that asks in interrogative form is, considering that our own species lived by foraging for more than 300,000 years, how and why did human society start to become more complex, especially after 4,000 years before present, or 4,000 years ago? And that's a kind of question that should scare the pants off any student starting a world history course. If they think, oh my goodness, I'm going to have to figure out how to answer that. That's a really big, complicated question. But it's a question that I would hope that students by the end of a course would begin to have the tools to be able to dig into and start to unpack. And you can see on the screen, the second point there is a differentiating between cause and effect. So then we've offered a specific question to help you think about cause and effect. sorry, the final one is a comparison question. Right? And we've modeled here a specific example of a comparative question, again, as a way to start thinking if your class is creating its own narrative, right? A Bill Wirtz narrative, a David Christian narrative, Panorama narrative that Ross and I worked on in Panorama. Those are all fine, right? But none of them is going to work specifically for your class. So what's your class's narrative going to be? And once you have a sense of that narrative, you can begin to start asking more specific questions that get at the AP concepts.
You've got some good questions down there about relating what we're doing to current events.
Yes.
And if I could just comment briefly, I think those are really very important. I'm one who, I don't really like the idea of embedding current events in textbooks or in curricula that are going to be around for a long time, because current events are constantly changing. Rather, you should be ready in the study of history to be referring to current developments whenever you have the opportunity. It's the way I did it when I was teaching world history. And but of course, we live in a world now in which we're facing world scale questions all the time. World trade, we're all hearing about that every day on the cable shows, and climate change. I mean, those are the two I think of right away. So we can easily relate those to developments in the past.
I think too, you could start with the present and getting at sort of like what you guys have in here about how complex we've gotten. If you start with the present, you know, kids can see how complex societies are in the different, in like, you know, social hierarchies and trade and politics and all these different factors. And so then when you know, even if you started with some conversation around that in like the first week about how complicated their own lives are, then you can kind of peel that back and say, okay, well then how did it become this complex?
And we can talk about what we mean by complexity as well. And what kind of lives did people live in earlier ages in terms of their complexity?
So if one strategy for making world history a manageable topic for a classroom with students of the skill levels and interests that you have, right, one of those strategies is to be intentional about the narrative that you want to tell, be aware that you're telling a narrative, and then focusing the students on asking questions that begin to get at that narrative, rather than simply giving them a lot of material. And the second really important strategy for getting at big picture and making world history manageable is a mantra that I learned from a colleague when Norma brought up my first job was teaching at the University of Texas, San Antonio. And when I was in San Antonio, one of my colleagues at San Antonio College, John Lee, used to literally walk up and down the streets of San Antonio when he was with other historians, proclaiming, dare to omit, right? It's okay if your students don't learn every detail that's in a textbook or every detail that's in a curriculum, if they're able to make sense of a historical narrative and to ask and answer questions. So for the dare to omit, I want to talk briefly about the period of post-colonial independence and the rhetoric of self-determination, right? This is a topic that all of you already cover in your classes in one sense or another. It's a topic that is addressed explicitly in the AP curriculum and framework. But it's a really hard topic to manage if you approach it from a regional perspective. Right? Because if you start thinking about what does the history of decolonization look like in Africa? What does it look like in South Asia or Southeast Asia? You start to get really mired into details without being able to help the students pull up and see the big picture. And the big picture here is really important, understanding that decolonization was a worldwide process, that all of these leaders were, if not in direct conversation with each other, very well informed about other events, well informed about relationships between leaders and leadership movements, that this was not happening anywhere in isolation. So you don't want to teach it in isolation. And if we're thinking about the AP test in particular, right, your students are not going to be materially disadvantaged. In fact, I would argue they're going to be better served if they know one or two examples with some detail and can really understand the process, rather than doing a name and an alphabet soup, right? This is the sort of approach that this slide suggests, that you need to know a little bit something about is happening in South Africa, in India, in Southeast Asia, in East Africa. Who were the leaders? What are the names? What were the time frames? That all gets to be a lot, particularly in a survey course. Right? But if instead you're focused on the process, you can emphasize the process with one or two examples, and then your students will be better equipped to start making those transitions and comparisons to other examples on their own. Crystal asks, so teach one in detail and then show similar events where it happened elsewhere. Yes, that's exactly what I'm talking about.
Yeah.
So now we want to pause a little bit and throw this back to you. Here are the three big process statements or goals from the AP framework. Any of them, whether we're talking about continuity and change, whether we're talking about cause and effect or comparison, make sense for understanding decolonization in general. What kind of question would you ask for your students based on what you're already teaching that could help them get at one of these three goals for the AP class? And while you guys are thinking and writing those answers, I'm going to look at some of these comments that just came up.
Yeah, please. There's a good question about teaching history backwards. And one of the correspondents said that he spoke to David Christian, the famous big historian, about this. It's here somewhere, Amanda. Yeah, there it is. Elizabeth said this, that there may be a danger in seeing events as inevitable. That is, that this came from that, and the other came from this, and so on. So without thinking constantly about multiple causation, I think you can really get into trouble with students. It's very common in society for people to think in terms of singular causation. This happened because of this period, when in fact there are very many variables involved. And historians recognize that you really can never come to a point where you absolutely know the cause of anything that is historically significant. It's very hard to do that. What you try to do is to understand the factors that accompany an event, and which ones of those factors are more important than others. So I think it's hard to do that kind of complicating of causation when you're going from front to back, from up to down. But it's a fun thing to do in terms of an exercise. I wouldn't build a whole course around it, but it's.
Can we restate the prompt here?
Getting a couple of questions here about what we're asking you to do. Take number 3, for example, right? And someone asked, yes, these are from they're not from the thematic section, they're from the skills-based section of the AP framework. Pick one of them, for example, number 3, which is asking a basic comparison skill, right? Can you construct a productive comparative question, a point of departure and inquiry for your class based on what you're already teaching? Don't do any new lesson plans, but if you're not starting the Cold War and decolonization movement or decolonization period of your class with an inquiry-based question, write one now what would a comparative question for that period look like, right? Or a CCOT question or a cause and effect question. I think comparison is probably the easiest to get a handle on.
Okay, so for any topic, not necessarily post-colonial independence, but for any topic, how might you write one of these types of questions that is looking at more of a bigger picture?
Yeah. Yeah, and I was thinking to focus it on independence, but if you've got another set of lessons that you really like to think about, use the time so that it makes most sense for you.
Yeah. So like if I was going to do one on independence, maybe it could be something like like trying to think, like, in what ways do independence movements affect, I don't know, women?
Yeah,
Would that work?
that would work. Or, you know, what role did women play in independence movements? And how would you explain similarities and differences in women's participation in different places? Pretty hard question for an introductory class. But I think that'd be a really rough exam question, but maybe not a bad point of departure inquiry question.
So we have one here. Christopher sent one. Explain the relationship between the cause of the Peace of Augsburg and subsequent effect upon the Treaty of Westphalia of 1648. What do you think?
Okay, so that's a pretty regionally specific, locally specific question. How would you expand that out into, no, that's okay. He's saying he teaches European history. That's great, but are there larger processes even in European history that you could begin to point to with that kind of question? Right?
So I think you can still step back, right?
Yeah. Relationships between church and state, the changing nature of state-to-state relationships and state-to-state governance that's implied by the Treaty of Westphalia, for example.
The treaty,
what social...
if you're looking at the significance of the Treaty of Westphalia, of course, political historians tell us that it's really the foundation for the whole state system as we have today. But that can also be debated too. I've forgotten the details of the Peace of Augsburg myself.
This one says, explain the significance of religious ideas in the emergence of social reform movements in the United States.
Where's that?
Yeah, I'm seeing a lot of really good questions.
It was the top one.
Changing racial attitudes, problems newly independent nations face in the post-colonial period, right? If we start with that one, what problems did they face in the colonial period, right? Again, what larger processes does that lead towards? I think that's Crystal's question that I'm talking about now, a good middle range kind of question. So again, we want to scale it up and think about what larger processes are in play.
Yeah, I think the word process is really important. So like you're really trying to attach what you're teaching to larger processes at play, right? Like things that are affecting more than just the group that you might be looking at.
Yeah, so again, I was thinking, Cold War, the increasing globalization of the economy, radicalization of racial ideas, the circulation of rhetoric of self-determination compared to the reality of the impetus for old empires to continue to assert their authority. All of those things help you scale up, right? And then from this middle question, then you begin to scale down, right? And you pick your examples. Which are the newly independent examples that you want to teach in your class? And in what ways do you then reinforce for the students that they're learning a couple of examples and that similar kinds of processes are happening everywhere, right? And I think if they're armed with this sense that they've got specific details, but then they know that similar things are happening elsewhere and that they can process that, that's what they need to be doing on the AP exam, more than simply being able to reach out and grab a bunch of disparate pieces of information and suck them into bubbles on a test form.
Yeah, and also I think if you kind of understand the process of something, if you didn't learn a specific example and that's the one you're asked about on the exam, you can kind of figure it out if you know the process behind it. Another piece I think would be great is, as a teacher, as you're like planning through the time periods in world history, for example, to like for yourself think about some of the larger processes happening in each time period and then build your lessons kind of around those things.
Could I comment on Cheryl, who's back up a bit with an S question at 2:44 p.m. I think that's a really interesting one. Explain the relevant similarities and or differences between independence movements in Africa versus Asia. Now, in fact, this is the way in the age when regionalism really governed the way we taught world history. Regionalism, civilizationism, or the nation state. It raises a really good question. I mean, were there intrinsic differences between nationalism movements in Asia and Africa? And if there were, what might they have been? But another way is to say, let's not separate the two, but look at any place in the world, even including the Caribbean, where nationalist movements were going on, and break across the regional barrier. One of my favorite questions is why is it that some colonies in Africa and or Asia achieved independence relatively peacefully, whereas in other places, violent revolutions had to occur or did occur before independence could be achieved. And I'm thinking of places, especially Algeria and Zimbabwe and Kenya to some extent, and Malaysia. Algeria is a really good comparison. You can show the Battle of Algiers in class to get at that one.
And Ross, the way that you were massaging Cheryl's question, right, I think is really important, because I think it matters for students to see that issues like the relative violence or peaceableness of a transition to post-colonial rule doesn't break down neatly on regional lines. It wasn't tidier in Asia and messier in Africa, or vice versa. That the range of violence, the degree of education and the role of local elites, the richness or lack of infrastructure and how that shaped, new national economies and new national political structures, right, don't break down on regional lines very easily, and they don't break down very nicely on colonial lines either. So if you're saying we're going to look at former British colonies or former French colonies or the former Dutch colonies, it's really much soupier. There's much more of a mix. And so getting students to ask these kinds of process questions, right, I think can break them out of some stereotypes they may come into class with. But more importantly, it really lays a foundation for how to ask important questions, which, given the richness that started in the conversations here about current events, right, that our students really need to have, right? They need to be able to figure out what are the important questions, what really matters here in a world in which the media onslaught is relentless, and it's harder and harder to separate fact from fiction, and what you need from what's just noise. And Cheryl, your comment, yes, that if you're analyzing the effects as well, then that moves us away from regionalism. That's a good point. And Paul, your finessing of the question, not just where was it more or less violent, but were there places where the violence worked better or not? Very good questions.
Should we push on since we have 10 minutes left?
So now we move on to the shameless plug for our book. If you want an example of what an question-based, inquiry-based world history narrative can look like and how it's adaptable to a classroom, this is the way we've structured our book. Ross, you want to take it?
Yeah, the major section of every chapter, major sections, whether there are 2 or 4 or 5, starts with what we call a focus question. And I just picked out a few of these at different ages of the past to exemplify what we've tried to do. And these aim mainly so that when students are reading that section of the chapter, they can have a fairly big question in mind. So for chapter 4, why did all human communities in Australia continue to forage and hunt from the initial human colonization of the continent down to modern times rather than adopt farming? Now, reading that chapter, you probably won't get all the answers to that question because the chapter deals with a much earlier period in history. But something really quite unusual happened there. A whole continent inhabited by people who did not take up farming, except some very special kinds of farming, what they call fire stick farming. We won't go into that. We're down to chapter 21, energy and industrialization. What were the basic features of the energy revolution and why did it represent a critical turning point in human history? And that chapter starts out with a few page discussion of what we mean by the energy revolution as the foundation of the Industrial Revolution. And I don't think it's picked up hasn't in the past been picked up by very many textbooks to the extent that we've done it. Generally, I think we've been able to pose questions these ways, partly because in this textbook, the whole world moves together through time. There's no regional chapters at all. The chapters are either hemispheric or global in scope. And that right away suggests all kinds of big questions and then comparisons related to those questions. So that's the end of the unpaid commercial.
And one more Ross-generated resource, right, is World History for Us All. And I see some of you have already posted links to that in the comments.
Yeah, thank you. How many of you have used World History for Us All? I'd love to see a poll on that one. I hope you have. Of course, it predates AP by just 1 year. And when we first got it started, we didn't even know AP was coming at the time. So it's not specifically for AP, but it's become quite complex. I have to add that we haven't had very much money for it in the last several years. It's been hard to get, as you well know, the state of the humanities in that respect. But it's there, and what is there continues to be very useful to AP teachers in thinking about these big questions. Nobody's voting that they use World History for Us All.
A lot of people said they did.
We're looking away. There was a whole string of them, Ross.
Oh, was there? I was looking over at the camera.
You got a lot of fans.
Now I'm looking at the camera, I think.
And here's Paul, who says he shares it with APSI participants all the time.
Oh, great. Oh, yeah. I'm sorry. I sent a message to the administrators, Laura and Amanda, and I lost track of these questions. Okay, great. Oh. Great.
All right.
What other?
Any other questions for them? Yeah.
There's nothing like this for U.S. history yet, and I've gotten that question many times.
One question was, is the one book of Panorama the same as the 3 volumes?
Sorry?
Yeah, well, that one I was just typing an answer to. So
Okay.
Panorama, there is one large volume of it, but the publisher also sells it broken in half, aimed at college courses that split, more or less 1,500. The publisher also sells a version broken into thirds for quarter system schools, like the one where I teach. And if you're interested, you can also get a custom version where you can pick and choose which chapters or sections of chapters.
So if AP World History goes as planned, one can start with the chapter, starts at 1200.
Also a note, like this year for Fiveable, when I go live for World History, I'm going to be basing my sessions off of some of the big questions that are asked in Panorama and trying to get at like bigger processes so that, in class, kids can learn some of the more specific concrete facts or reading the textbook. But in my live sessions, we can kind of discuss bigger picture things. Yes. Yep. Everything you will all have access to, all the teachers will have access to as well. And I'll have a schedule of sessions to share ahead of time so you can plan around them as well. All right. So, yeah, I just want to really thank you both, Laura and Ross. I think this was just a really excellent session to just kind of push the common history narrative further into, I don't know, just like it gives us like a lot to think about and a lot to process and making our courses bigger picture. A couple of things. First, I'll post a similar poll that I've posted in all the live sessions about just how helpful. And another last thing I'm going to share is summit feedback. I'm going to be sharing this I'll email this out to all later. This isn't just feedback for this session, but this is feedback for like the whole summit. And so I'll send that again, but if you could just take a few minutes, anyone who attended the sessions, to just fill it out and let us know, what you liked, what we could do better at, because we're definitely going to do more things like this. And then if you guys have any other questions for Laura and Ross, feel free to drop them in, and maybe we could take one or two more. Otherwise, thank you.
Okay. Reading the last one here now it's not the last one.
Yeah. You got to read
jumps a little.
The comments come in quickly.
Yeah, if you sort of like scroll a little bit, then it'll stay where you're at.
Barbara has made my day. She's definitely changing to the big picture approach this year.
You sold her. All right, so all of the sessions from today will be posted in just a little while, and on there also are contact information for both Ross and Laura. And so if you have future questions, you'll be able to contact them on Twitter and whatnot. And all right, so that's the end of the live summit. Thank you guys so much again for coming and sharing your expertise with us. And thanks to all who have come and given up a weekend in early August on how to teach history.
So Amanda, before we go, I just want to chime in. I'm responding to Crystal in the text, but I want to reinforce this for everyone, because she was asking about posting these kinds of big picture, big concept questions on the AP Facebook group. And yeah, do it, and do it as workshopping, right? If you have courses that you're interested in, put them out there, ask people to chime in, to think about scaling both up and down. Is this the biggest picture question possible?
I'm going to post some.
Okay.
On the AP World History Facebook page that come out of an institute that we did here in the Los Angeles area on big questions. I'm going to put that up shortly on that site. you can spread it around.
Awesome.
All right.
All right, y'all. Thanks again so much.
And thank you, Amanda, for having us on and for starting this conversation in this forum. This is great.
For sure. Yeah, and we'll definitely continue these conversations throughout the year. Awesome. All right, well, thanks again, and I'll see you guys later.
All right. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.